could I suggest that you mute yourself in order to avoid any interruption? What we'll do is I will invite speakers to speak for about 5-7 minutes maximum to present their position. Then we'll have a small panel discussion where I ask you about your recommendations to the international stakeholders, and then we will invite questions from the audience. And the audience can use either the chat function or raise their hand, which they can see at the bottom panel of their screen. Just to mention also, we have 3 working languages, English, Russian, and Belarusian, and simultaneous translation. So for that option, yet again, there is a button called interpretation at the bottom of your screen. So please use it if you require any translation. The final thing to mention before I introduce our speakers is that the webinar is also live streamed to YouTube, and the recording will be available after the discussion on the websites of the 3 centers I mentioned at the beginning. So now perhaps the most pleasant part is the introduction of our speakers today. I'll begin with Franak Viačorka. Hello. Franak is a senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and now a regular attendee and speaker at Oxford Belarus Observatory webinars. So Franak is also head of the foreign policy department at Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's office. He is also non-residential fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasian Center, and also a journalist by training who having worked in various capacities around the world. I should mention one more thing which impressed, obviously there are a lot of impressive things about Franak's biography, but this one is perhaps one of the most impressive, that Franak was the first Václav Havel fellow at the Radio Free Europe on Havel's personal recommendation. The next speaker is going to be Vladislav Inozemtsev, who is here with us as well, who is founder and director of the Center for Post-Industrial Studies. He is also professor of economics, head of World Economy International Trade Division at Moscow State University, and also professor at the Higher School of Economics. Vladislav, we will need your recommendation how you combine all these positions so effectively. Vladislav also a member of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. He is also a presidium member of the Russian International Affairs Council. He's also columnist at the same time. So lots of parallels with Franak's activities too. So columnist at Ведомости, Московский комсомолец, Аргументы and Факты, but also Комсомольская правда. And most recently, Vladislav, you mentioned now that you spent half a year in Washington, D.C., having another position there, which I missed. Yeah. Okay, working on Russian program there. The next speaker will be Arkady Moses. Hello, Arkady. Arkady is also well known and perhaps does not need any kind of in-depth introduction, just to mention that Arkady is a program director for the EU Eastern Neighborhood and Russia Research Program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And he's also a member of PONARS, Eurasia at George Washington University, and also a member of EU-Russia Expert Network, EU-REN. He worked in various capacities yet again around the globe, including Chatham House, and he is also a visiting scholar to the Danish Institute of International Affairs, which sends hello to you. I was there recently. And at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And he is also a very prolific writer and a media commentator. So welcome, Arkady. And we are hoping that we will have also Ruth Diamond from the King's College London, who will join us, I hope, later.
Eleanor, she's here.
She's here. Sorry,
yes.
I can't see her. Okay.
Waving to you.
Sorry, I'll just put, okay, I'll put gallery. Oh yes, hi Ruth, sorry. Hello and welcome too. So Ruth is a senior lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. But before joining King's, Ruth also worked at Her Majesty Treasury in areas including UK policy towards the international financial institutions and the Department of the Private Finance Initiative. So her first degree actually was in English language and literature from Oxford, and also in English and European Renaissance drama from the University of Warwick. Ruth is convening the department's Russian and Eurasian Security Research Group, and currently focuses on Russian foreign policy, particularly towards the post-Soviet space. And also Ruth is a very prolific writer and regular media commentator. So I think we have an absolutely star list today to have a very important discussion with the focus on Belarus-Russia integration, which, as you know, has intensified over the recent years. At the same time, raising a lot of questions, especially that why do we need another integration if there is already one more or less functioning, i.e. the European Eurasian Union. So today we will explore the nature and especially the implications of this increased integration for the country, for Belarus especially, but also for the wider region, especially under the current circumstances of a looming war, Russia-Ukraine war in the post-Soviet space. So as I said, speakers, I would invite speakers to give their 5-7 minutes position, and then we'll have a panel discussion with recommendations for the international stakeholders, and then we'll start gathering questions. Thank you. Perhaps Franak, I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Congratulations on this event and fantastic group of speakers. Belarus-Russia topic is super actual right now, especially having thousands of troops and military vehicles come into the country on a daily basis. And there is ongoing discussion, will these troops are going to stay in the country or will they leave? And the recent news came from Ministry of Defense of Belarus, saying that of course they will leave, but some other sources they're not so sure. And intelligence that we receive also say that there is a huge, big possibility these troops will not leave the country just after the drills on February 20, but will stay longer, which will definitely create the risk and threat to Belarus independence and sovereignty. And this uncertainty, which we have right now with these Russian troops in the country, it exists around Belarus-Russian relationship for 27 years. Since Lukashenko came to power, since Russian-Belarusian integration started in the end of 90s, we always were living in this uncertainty. Nobody understood what is the Union state. The road maps, which we discussed heavily last year, were also actual topic in 1999. And for those who remember that time, they raised the same alarm about road maps 23 years ago as in 2020. It means that on one hand, there is the willingness to live together, to find the way to collaborate, to build transparent relationship, but there is no clear understanding within Belarusian society how this relationship, how this integration should look like. In 2020, we faced not geopolitical protest. There was no anti-Russian slogans at the rallies. And back then, there was no strong anti-Russian feelings within Belarusian society. The number of those who were pro-Russian and pro-European before Revolution 2020 and 15, 20 years ago didn't change significantly. Always there was a big group of those who believed that Belarus must become part of the EU. Always there was a group more or less the same pro-Russian Union, but the majority was always choosing either neutrality or being in alliance with both. Belarusians believe, and this become part of our mentality, our narrative, and our ideology, that we can be in good relationship with both the European Union and Moscow. And this was part of the revolutionary narrative in 2020 as well, despite Lukashenko's attempts to present Belarusian protests as purely anti-Russian and pro-Western. Since the fall 2020, the attitudes towards Russia changed a bit, and there is a definitely growing anti-Russian sentiment among a protest core. People are offended that Putin, Kremlin decided to support Lukashenko, first financially, then informationally. They sent Russia Today specialists to the country, and right now they are basically holding Lukashenko on the shoulders of Russia, allowing him to stay in power. This anti-Russianism, it's not toxic. I think it is related more to misunderstanding. Yesterday there was a very interesting movie published by Yuri Dudь, popular Russian blogger, where he is interviewing people who fled Belarus. Among them, you could see people who say, "I was always pro-Russian, I was always loving Putin, but I don't understand." And I think this change in sentiment, it is connected primarily to misunderstanding of illogical behavior of Russia after 2020, because Russia could behave differently. At least it could not openly support Lukashenko. This is something most of us hoped on. Roadmaps on integration, which were signed last year, was a very big deal, was in the center of discussion. It was a huge concern for all of us, but since these roadmaps were signed, there was no real progress. A few days ago, we had the conversation with our contacts within nomenclatura. Some of the people are still in the regime, some of the people left recently, but they say that no many people really believe that these roadmaps will be implemented. And therefore, we should not raise alarm, we should be cautious, we should be attentive, but we should not be alarmistic here. We should not fall into panic that Belarusian independence is already solved. A few days ago, I saw the Polish video where the judge decided to not give Roman Protasevich to Belarus. And he says, as an argument, that Belarus perhaps is not an independent state anymore. So therefore, we will not give Roman Protasevich back to Belarus. I think this is too extreme position. I think we are not yet part of Russia. And this kind of claim is a bit misleading, saying that Belarus is not an independent country anymore. But on the other hand, assumption that Lukashenko is fully independent player who decides what to do and what to do not, it's also misleading. I think the truth is somewhere in between. He is trying to use the situation, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in his advantage. He is trying to demonstrate symbolic loyalty by sending troops to Kazakhstan, by letting Russian troops come into Belarus. This is also the price he pays for the support Kremlin gave to him in 2020 and continues to give at this moment. But we don't believe that this support it is something unchangeable. We don't believe that Russia will be always working with Lukashenko, because there is, I think, clear understanding that Lukashenko will lie, will cheat, and will use every opportunity to lie, to fake things that he promised. But on the other hand, we should not also put all eggs in one basket and believe that Russia will help us in solving the crisis in the country. So today we, as the Office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, we are trying to balance in our narratives. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was given a very clear mandate to lead the country to new elections. People who voted for her represented both pro-Russian and pro-European audiences and pro-neutrality groups as well. And we hope that at some point, when the moment of negotiations will come, Russia, along with other neighbors, along with the US and EU, will agree to become mediators in the negotiations on the future of Belarus. This is our primary goal. So we, So I will stop here, and we'll leave time for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Franak. On this very note, especially when you mentioned the challenges, but also potential benefits here, I would like to take us directly to Vladislav and perhaps ask him what kind of benefits is now being anticipated from this tighter union, especially for Belarus, because somewhere in the news I also read that Belarus expects about $1 trillion of direct revenues. Where from and how come? But anyway, Vladislav, the floor is yours.
Look, first of all, I would say that I agree with Franak in almost everything he said, except of some kind of conclusions. And first of all, it's absolutely true that Lukashenko is still an independent leader. He believes actually nothing has changed since 2020. From the time before the elections, he feels strong Russian support. And I think the support will endure because President Putin now sees Lukashenko. Maybe, of course, he doesn't see him as his puppet, but of course he will continue his support for very different reasons. I argued many times that Russia repeated what Lukashenko did in Belarus with some, with some time difference. For example, Lukashenko started with re-establishing the Soviet insignia, and Putin started with the same kind of things when he came to power in 2000. And a lot of steps were just repeated. And I wrote a big article in 2015 in Vedomosti newspaper in Moscow saying that Russia is going just the same path Belarus is going. And we saw repetition of the actions of Lukashenko when Putin changed the constitution and lifted the limits for presidential terms and whatsoever. So there are a lot of things in which Russia follows Lukashenko regime. And therefore, for Mr. Putin, is very, very harmful if Lukashenko's position is challenged, because he looks on him like on himself. But a little bit more Lukashenko has more experience in power than Putin for around 7 more years. Anyway, I think that Putin will not allow Lukashenko's regime to crumble just because it would be seen as a prerequisite for the Russian regime demise as well. Another point is about the integration. Look, the talks about the integration are going on for 20 years. In many cases, it was quite successful. The economic integration between Belarus and Russia is by far the most intensive in the post-Soviet space. And the citizens of both countries have quite equal rights on the territory of another country. And so I actually would not say there is a lot more to be achieved in this integration movement. And therefore, I have not surprised. It was not surprise for me that after these roadmaps were signed, nothing actually happened. And I would not expect everything to happen, except, for example, of single currency, which Lukashenko opposes, about the united leadership of the military forces, which Lukashenko opposes. And so, therefore, I would say that Franak is absolutely right, saying that no one should fear the integration like it looks now, except one point I would add. This point is about economy. And what is changing now is the increase of economic influence of Russia over Belarus. It's not only because of new loans and financial assistance Russia produces, but first of all, because of Western sanctions. I would say Russia will will get more and more control over Belarusian strategic industries. For example, the potassium industry, because I think oil products will be exported via Russia with Russian counterparts, with Russian intermediaries. And therefore, I think that even part of the former revenues Lukashenko got from the strategic industries will somehow flow into Belarus from the Russian side. And this will increase because Russia has a lot of interest in controlling Belarusian strategic enterprises. There are some Russian oligarchs who are very interested in doing this for purely economic reasons. And this is where the interests of Russian political elite and Russian business elite actually coincide. And therefore, I would say that Belarus will presumably lose part of its economic independence, even it remains a fully independent country politically, as it can be seen from abroad. And other several points I would mention, then I would stop. First of all, I would say that Russia is, from my point of view, is not entirely interested in fully integrating or enclosing Belarus into Russia for different reasons. Because Belarusian people are much more now, at least pro-European. They're much more independently thinking. They're much more prone to act politically as they did in 2020. Nothing comparable happened to Russia for 20 years. And so I would doubt that Mr. Putin wants to get another 9 million citizens into Russian citizenship who might become quite, a driving force for new, this time Russian protests in some cases. Another point is that I absolutely exclude the possibility that Mr. Putin will embrace Ms. Lukashenko, Ms. Tikhanovskaya sometime, even if there are another wave of protests in Belarus. I think that after what happened in 2020, 2021, he will never have a dialogue with Svetlana. And if Putin or if Russia will back if Russia backs some opposition figure in Belarus, it will definitely not be Svetlana, because Mr. Putin definitely don't want to have any deals with someone who is backed by the popular movement. He is very proud of this. The last point is about the Western political attitude and what can be done. Actually, I will just send to anybody my recent article in The Independent. It was published on December 2nd, when in Brussels anti-Lukashenko sanctions were debated. And actually, I think that sanction policies should be tightened, and it should be aimed on cutting all trade flows from and via Belarus, because actually Belarus is a very high, it's a very important transit route for the Russian goods coming to Europe and for European goods coming to Russia. And also it is seen as a part of maybe China-Europe corridor versus Russia and Belarus. So if the Europeans can actually completely cut all the transit flows from via Belarus, it will be a very huge blow to Russia, even psychologically. Yeah, so there are a lot of other kinds of sanctions which should be, I think, implemented. And what is most important, and I will stop here, that all these sanctions, the Europeans or the Americans or the British, they should make it very clear that all these sanctions will automatically be expanded on Russia if Russia incorporates Belarus in its political structure. So Putin should understand that if he wants to get Belarus, he will get this with a lot of other problems he will incorporate in daily Russian life. That's it.
Thank you very much, Vladislav. Some very interesting points. Actually, on the last point of sanctions, just to mention that our next webinar in a week's time will be dedicated to sanctions. So I do hope that you will attend it as well, together with our large audience. Thank you. What you've mentioned there, sort of suggesting that perhaps deeper integration may not necessarily be the case, but deeper dependency of Belarus on Russia is definitely going to debate, actually takes us very neatly to Arkady. And I hope that Arkady will be able to say a few words, the views across the border. So Arkady, what's the view on the situation from Finland? Thank you.
Well, I'm thankful for the invitation, but I will give you my point of view. I will probably disappoint you, but Belarus in the situation, Belarus especially now, is not at the center of attention in Finland. So there's a group of people that follows it, but this group is still small. I'll make several points. One is I also have an opinion about the integration, a terminological opinion. I think that essentially it's a wrong term. Speaking about integration, the way we know it from Europe in the Belarusian case is irrelevant. It's essentially a bureaucratic exercise. Some people were paid for more than 2 decades for reshuffling papers, which they did successfully, and they continue doing so. And this 28 programs that we've been talking earlier today is a great example. People were negotiating this document for 3 years. Its validity was 26 months. It's only valid until the end of 2023. In order to enact this document, according to the Russian Prime Minister, we would need another 300 to 400 acts passed by respective parliaments and so on and so forth. Probably people who negotiated or authored that document know how weak it is and how it would not be able to pass any scrutiny, and that's why it has not been published. There's no text to analyze because I suspect it's absolutely empty. There is one great program on cooperation in the field of tourism. Okay, that's definitely important, but maybe that we should know a little bit more about what has been prepared by the 2 diplomatic teams. I suspect that pretty much the same can be said about the new military doctrine of the Union State. Because some people were thinking it's an innovation. It's not. The military doctrine of the Union State has existed since 2001. Yes, this current one was negotiated also for a long time, and Lukashenko was trying to make it a kind of a instrument or lever vis-a-vis Russia. But the point is that it's probably not that important. What is important is exactly what Elena has said. We should ask ourselves a question: whether Belarus's dependence on Russia has reached a critical degree. Because this country has been going along the way towards the increase of its dependence on structural dependence on Russia, I repeat. Not since the day Lukashenko came to power in 1994, but since the day Putin came to power and Lukashenko faced choices. Before that, he could have had illusions whether he was going to become a president of Russia one day. But from that moment on, it should have been clear to everybody that he wasn't. So he had choices to make, and he made the choices. And the choices were the increasing Belarus's dependence on Russia. If you look Vladislav has been talking about the economy. It is kind of obvious that if your economy should be subsidized by Russia at times by 20% of GDP, and in better days to 10 to 15% GDP, your freedom of maneuver is pretty much limited. If you sell your biggest asset, or not even sell, give it to the Gazprom, the gas transportation system, which Ukraine refused to do, and that's why it kept certain leverage, which Belarus hasn't. You should understand that the economic underpinning of your independence is not that great. And that was Lukashenko's choice. And that was Lukashenko's choice to bring Belarus into the Eurasian Economic Union, a community before. It's not because somebody twisted his hands, as it was in the case of Armenia. It's because he thought that was right for his country. If you look at the policy, which should be the backbone of a sovereignty of any country, which is the education policy, what was the ideological policy of Lukashenko? That Belarusians are Russians with the quality stamp, that probably education in Belarusian is not that much needed. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there is any university in Belarus with the Belarusian as a language of instruction, and so on. And that could have been changed. But he didn't want to change it because he thought the right way to go was basically to exterminate the Belarusian ethnic, not even necessarily ethnic-based identity, but the features that would distinguish Belarusians from the Russians. There was a point when 65%, according to official data, when 65% of content in all the Belarusian media was coming from Moscow, and so on and so forth. And then you take security sphere. I mean, Belarus was considered to be an extension of Russia in the military sense for more than a decade by now. And again, that was because he thought that was the way for him to go, because he, like his like-minded people in Kremlin, thought that a threat to Belarus would be coming from the West, that NATO was the enemy, that NATO was the problem. And that's why he wanted to have this integrated air defense and hundreds and hundreds, if you take years, drills, exercises of different scale, all this West exercises, all this Union Shield, you name it. I mean, it's been going on for decades. So is there an independent Belarusian military at the moment? Probably not. I mean, if there's anything integrated into the Russian military, it is the Belarusian, into the Russian military, it is the Belarusian system. So, but this is not the end, and this is where the paradoxes start, because if you ask the question, you can still argue it both ways, because you can say that the critical degree has been achieved. I was saying it myself for many years. If you read everything I wrote between 2015 and 2020, when so many colleagues were enjoying the policy of sun warmth that the West was conducting towards Lukashenko, of which I was radically critical and couldn't ever agree with that policy. So one of the conclusions that I was making was that Russia was not concerned at all. I mean, okay, there were some signs that there might have been certain disagreement in Kremlin. Of course, there was no trust to Lukashenko, but there was no real concern. Russians knew that the dependence was high enough so that they could take it easily.
Thank you. Thank you, Arkady.
But this is not the end, because as I said, you can argue it both ways. And this is where I'm coming to the optimistic part of my, or hopeful at least, part of my presentation. For as long as there are no military bases of Russia on the territory of Belarus, and more importantly, for as long as Belarusian army has not become a part of an invasion in Ukraine, you can still argue that this critical line, the point of no return, has not been passed. Because all we know from history, and for what, for example, differs the Cold War period from the post-Soviet period in terms of the Russian control over certain countries, is that there are no military bases of Russia in the countries where they're not welcome. There was an exception, Sevastopol, and we know how that ended, but that was still an exception. And or the rule, if you want. So for as long as there are no these bases, you can still argue that the critical line has not been surpassed. And I will argue even more. Even if that happens, the situation will not be irreversible. Because again, what we know from history, from the WTO, which was not in those days the World Trade Organization, but the Warsaw Treaty Organization, you can have bases for decades, but that's not the end of history of an individual country. So my recommendation, and this is where I'm ending, is that even if bad things happen, people should not give up in advance. They should not accept as a given and as a granted that the future of Belarus would always be either neutrality or Finlandization or a defense alliance with Russia. Things can change, circumstances can change, and I think what we should do is, instead of promoting this narrative, be promoting the narrative about the possibility for Belarus to have a European future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arkady, for actually shifting slightly from your apocalyptic note to a bit more positive, hopeful vision of the future, but it still brings us to a very important point, this military doctrine, which you say there is nothing new, and yet we have 100,000 troops present at the moment on the territory of Belarus. I wonder if Ruth could possibly say a few more words, especially in terms of Russia's foreign policy and sort of views from Europe on that as well. And then we'll take it from there for a small panel discussion. Please, Ruth.
Yes, and thank you, and thank you for the invitation to take part in this extremely interesting and extremely important discussion. So I was asked to, and I want to talk about the Western perspective, understood in very general terms. So really the perspective that we can see coming out of Western institutions, particularly NATO. But also key European states, or some key European states, and I'll talk perhaps a little bit more about the UK, since that's where I am, and also the US. I think I would preface this by saying, as no doubt everyone is already very well aware, and as we can see in relation to the debates about Ukraine at the moment, there is not a single Western perspective, right? So the position that we can see developing on questions of, the Russia-Belarus relationship, as well as Ukraine, the position that we can see emerging, say, in Germany, looks rather different to the position in the UK. But with that proviso, I think we can say some general things about Western governmental and media, and to a degree think tank perspectives on all of this. I should also say that this is not an endorsement, right? These views are not necessarily mine. So I think the first thing is to recognise is that for very many years, I mean, really at the whole of this century, and to a very large degree, both Belarusian domestic politics and perhaps particularly foreign policy have been understood by Western states and by key institutions really as an extension of the Russian state. There hasn't been a proper attempt in many cases to properly engage with the idea of Belarus as a distinctive international actor, with a capacity to develop an independent, particularly an independent military policy, for reasons that I will come to. But if that's been the case generally, I think it's been particularly the case, of course, in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential elections. And since then, really, most Western analysis, I would say, particularly the media and also a lot of governments, have really portrayed Lukashenko as entirely dependent on the Russian government. And therefore, it's assumed, really, all Belarusian government actions as being determined by the Kremlin. And this has been the case, I think, even when the actions of Lukashenko are obviously not really in the Russian government's interests, such as the threat last autumn to cut gas supplies to other European states. Even that was often interpreted as a maneuver by Putin. And so any further moves to formalize Russia-Belarusian integration are going to be understood in the same way as a function of Russian power over Belarus. And they're often interpreted in Western analysis as evidence of Putin's ability to extract any price that he chooses for shoring up the Lukashenko presidency. But one of the things that's striking, at least striking to me, is the complete absence of comment certainly in the British and the American governments on these recent developments, on the additional moves to push forward the Russia-Belarus Union. There hasn't really been any engagement with these developments, and this reflects a much longer term lack of discussion about the specific idea of a Russia-Belarus Union, including any discussion really of a formal military union. To a significant extent, this has been reflective of as I think I said a moment ago, a kind of shameful lack of engagement with Belarus as a state before the 2020 elections. But I think it's also, and this has already been touched on, a product of the more than 20 years experience of the failure of the Union state to manifest as a politically meaningful institution. And I think for a lot of Western governments and analysts, it falls therefore into the same category as a number of other post-Soviet regional structures, the CIS initially, and to a degree, although maybe less so, now the CSTO, really as paper institutions that reflect Russian dominance and which don't progress to more meaningful life because there's no incentive for Russia to develop them, or in some cases because conflicts over their direction between Russia and the other member states prevent it. Of course, none of this is to say that Western states and analysts are not currently interested in Belarus as a European actor and in the fundamental role played in that regard by integration with Russia. And on the contrary, I think at the moment we can see that perhaps for the first time in the post-Cold War period, Belarus is now understood as an important factor in the European security situation. And the two areas in which this is most visible, of course, are the migrant crisis at the border with NATO and EU states and the current very significant buildup of Russian troops on Belarusian territory. In both cases, but particularly the latter, Belarus's role is often seen, I think, as little more than effectively a prosthesis for the Russian government, a means for the Russian government to extend its strategic space and to apply pressure to NATO and EU states via their weak spots. And this is particularly true for the migrant crisis, of course. And very often, the Belarusian government, Lukashenko's own motivations, again, particularly in the case of the migrant crisis, are too often neglected, though not entirely, but they're subsumed very often under concerns about what Putin is doing in relation to these things. But there's also, I think, we're seeing, and at least in the UK, to the extent that Belarus is being talked about by the government, we're seeing a kind of widening of the narrative, and some, and most strikingly the current British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, is interpreting the closer relationship of Russia and Belarus as part of a broader axis of authoritarianism that she thinks, or she has been talking about as emerging, something that includes China and other authoritarian states, and against which the UK in particular and the West in general has a duty to defend its allies and its values. And in this context, any development of the Russia-Belarus Union, to the extent that it's acknowledged, assumes not just an importance for the security of European and of Eastern and Central Europe, but a significance for the future shape of international order. Obviously, whether that assumption has real-world consequences for policy making remains to be seen. But if there is war in Ukraine, and particularly if that involves invasion from the territory of Belarus, that narrative of Belarusian integration with Russia as part of a global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism is only going to strengthen. And I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ruth. It gave us another very comprehensive, and I would say, rounding discussion and a focus to continue. So could I please, before we open the floor to the audience, I would like to have a very short, given the time, discussion between ourselves. And the question, I would like to go back to the original question: who needs this union? And then I thought, after listening to all of you, that what kind of new union actually both parties seek? Because someone in the audience actually mentioned that if anything, nothing has really changed, and just rehearsing the same points, except that the military presence of Russia has clearly increased on the territory of Belarus, and it looks like this union is increasingly turning into political military union, security union of some sorts. And would Lukashenko still remain independent in his decision making in that sense? Rus mentioned CSTO, and I don't think it's a paper institution, at least not the way it acted recently in Kazakhstan, how quickly it resolved the crisis. And now the fact that we have this military presence in Belarus, allegedly in preparation to all sorts of encroachments nearby. Its purpose and implications, well, some call it bluntly, occupation of Belarus. So what kind of union? Why we need this union? And independence of Lukashenko in that sense. Who would like to go first? Franak.
Of course, yes. I think that's the right question. And when people in Belarus are asked about union with Russia, everyone understands different things. I think in the mindset of Belarusians, they see union both with Russia, with the European Union as something mutually beneficial, transparent. They can freely travel, they can open business. So it's about comfort of life. But when you ask them through the surveys, we can see it, about the currency, should we have joint currency, then the number of supporters of union decreased 10 times. When you ask, should Belarus and Russia become the one state, this number is always between 4 and 7% maximum, never more than 7% of support. So when we ask about military bases, there will be more or less same number. So Belarusians want to be in union, preserving their status of the neutral country, the bridge between West and East, which became the part of mentality. When I was in school, in the first year grades of school, you're explained that Belarus is the bridge between Russia and the West. And I think this is the way of thinking of ordinary Belarusians right now. They want to be the bridge, they want to be in unions, they want to be friends to everyone, but they don't want to lose what they have. Languages, their own territory, their own governance system, their currency. The level of this non-toxic nationalism, it increased significantly in last 20 years. When I was in school, and when you ask about which country is the closest to Belarus, of course it will be Moscow, Russia. It was like the ultimate goal, to finish somewhere in Russia, working with business or making some profits there. Right now, it's not this way. Many IT companies right now, they actually are very good symbol of this modern patriotism. They say, yes, right now we can't make business in Belarus, we emigrate in order to come back to Belarus. Students who are accepted for the foreign scholarships, many of them plan to come back to Belarus. And I think because they love Belarus, because they want to see Belarus independent, and they will never accept that Belarus will be part of Russia, let's say. And military bases, I think this is something which sounds like nightmare for many. Belarusians don't know about existing military bases. De facto we have, which are not military bases as we usually see them. But there is a training center discussed near Grodno, which actually is supposed to become the real military base. And why people don't protest against it? Because they don't know. Why people don't protest right now against Russian troops coming to the country? Because they don't see it. We are here on this Zoom, we know about it, but for absolute majority of the people who are in the country and living in the information vacuum, all these events are not happening. They don't know what's going on. And this is the problem, and this creates additional risks for Belarus independence because many things can happen behind the scene.
Thank you very much, Franak. You see, that actually poses a lot of questions in some way. So when we talk about union, Belarus clearly was very much interested in economic benefits in the first place. But then these benefits were provided to a degree by the potential of the Eurasian Economic Union, to which Belarus was reluctant to join, then why now? Why another union? And it looks like actually very much the incentive comes from Russia, who actually seeks very much the security political union. And reading into actually the commentary by Dmitry Mizentsev about what he called new military doctrine, the purpose of this new military doctrine, as he said, is to ensure consistency of defense policy and rapid response to any insurgencies or problems. So what kind of union? Arkady, you look very stern there.
I'm not sure I actually understand what we are talking about. Because if we are talking about union, as Franak has just said, something vague, amorphous, which nobody understands, this is one story. If we are talking about the union state, which is something bigger than an international organization and something less than a state, if we're talking about the latter, that probably only Lukashenko needs it because he thinks or used to think that this is a channel through which he can get extra money from Russia. I don't think he thinks that now, because Russia has become much less generous and lavish than it used to be. I mean, again, I've been arguing that the Russian policy can be called same for less, and I've been arguing it well before the August 2020. In order to continue the defense cooperation, you don't need union. If you're Russia and if you want the defense alliance, you don't need the union state. You just make a defense alliance. I'm not even sure whether Russia wants a proper defense alliance. It wants the right and the actual possibility to use Belarusian territory and their space if need be. In order to achieve that, you need to corner the ruler like Lukashenko. And this is, I think, what it has been doing more or less successfully, still more or less, not 100% successfully, more or less successfully. But again, that's why I started, that talking about integration makes less, just to have a discussion about that has less and less sense. You have to see, it's a relationship which could have been the examples of or parallels to which could be found in the 19th century. A big state and a small state, and a big state offers something to the small state it cannot refuse. But you don't need all this cover, you don't need the fleur, you don't need the fog. You just come and talk straight. We'll see how that's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And being conscious of the time, I will probably now open the floor to the audience. And there are actually some good questions, one for Ruth, and one I think I will direct to Vladislav. So Ruth, there is a question from Anna Davidson. I will read it to you. You said that Western analysis portray the Belarusian government's actions as determined by the Kremlin. So in what ways would you say that Lukashenko's behavior has been independent of the Russian government? In what situations have you seen that he is or the Belarusian government are confident going against the Kremlin?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm not actually suggesting the latter at all. I don't think that's something that we can see, right? It's more that I think because, I mean, as I'm sure everybody here is all too aware, you know, for a very long time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a kind of analytical disengagement by Western political elites from thinking about the post-Soviet space, right? From thinking about the states that had been part of the Soviet Union. And far too often the focus was exclusively on Russia. There's been very little focus on Belarus, which is one of the major problems from my perspective. I think that feeds into a tendency. Politicians, probably, I don't know, this is just my perspective as a former civil servant, but politicians will often go for the easiest line, right? The easiest thing to understand. And the easiest thing for Western politicians to understand, I think, really is that Belarus is basically, a subset of Russia from a geopolitical point of view, from the point of view of military concerns. That we therefore don't need to consider whether the Belarusian government has its own interests in relation to the West, for instance. I mean, obviously that's been slightly different in the economic sphere and the energy sphere, but on military questions, Belarus and Russia have been treated as one and the same. Belarus simply as a subset of Russia, and I don't think that's helpful for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, as I say, because you can see that, for example, when Lukashenko threatened to turn off the gas taps in the autumn, that was obviously not something that the Russian government looked on favourably. So you can see cases where there are divergences. But also, the tendency by a lot of Western media in particular to treat the migrant crisis simply as something that Putin has decided that he wants to happen, right? And that the Belarusian government really has nothing to do with it. It's simply there to act as a cipher for Russia. And that, of course, neglects Lukashenko's own issues with the European Union and the desire to test the European Union. So I think, if we're going to if Western states are going to make sense of Belarus as a political and a military actor, there needs to be a recognition that Belarus, exists as a political and military entity, however dominated militarily by Russia. It's not helpful simply to continue to neglect Belarus as an important feature of the European security landscape, which I think is what has been happening.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth, for this answer. There is a question also from Jakub Wallenstein, which I will direct to Vladislav, and I'll read it quickly. Some argue that Russia supports Lukashenko because Belarus is their best guarantee for safeguarding their geopolitical interests. He would and could never take the country west. And that in order to stop supporting him and maybe even embrace a more pluralistic, not to say democratic alternative, in Belarus, they would have to have a different type of guarantee or like military base. What do you make of this argument?
Look, there are 2 points here to mention. First is about Ms. Tikhanovskaya and the way she came to, maybe not to power, but to the result she showed in presidential elections in August 2020. For Mr. Putin, I would say it's the very idea that someone who challenged your ally in a democratic fashion, democratic manner, and came to power and approaches you as a partner in negotiations is absolutely impossible to take as a granted. So from my point of view, if there was another chance for Belarusian opposition to build their relationship with Russia, if, for example, it were someone who well before the presidential campaign made good ties with Moscow, who was greeted in Moscow and in the Russian elite as well as a possible contender to Lukashenko. For example, as Mr. Babariko seemed he might be like a person like this. In this case, yes, might be Moscow would speak to this person and acknowledge him or her as a president and build up their strategy towards new Belarus. In Tikhanovska's case, it's absolutely against any rules that Mr. Putin wants and is ready to follow. So the democratic election is, and the person who wins the democratic elections couldn't be Putin's best friend. as Yushchenko never was, as Poroshenko also never was. And in many cases, we have the same situation. This is the first point. The second point is about the West. Yes, of course, the security issue for Mr. Putin looms very large. And all this quarrel with Ukraine and with the West, the recent quarrel is going because of Russia presumably wants security guarantees. And of course, Belarus, under any other person than Lukashenko, because he is assumed as a rogue leader. So Belarus might be a good, I would say, a partner to the Western countries, and this is unacceptable for Russia. So yes, there are 2 points here. First, personality of Ms. Tikhanovskaya, and the second, the security concern that will prevent Moscow from, accepting this alternative, I would say. Yeah, it's a very complex issue.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vladislav. On that, actually, I would like to pick up another question from the audience, which I will probably...
May I jump in here, Elena?
Yes, please do.
Very quickly, 2 sentences. Lukashenko without the military base is a guarantee that Belarus will not go west. The military base alone will not be able to guarantee that, because if there is a different government, the base will not help. I mean, that's what Putin remembers from his own young years in the DDR and how all that ended. Lukashenko and the military base is, of course, even a better guarantee, but Lukashenko alone is enough. That's the dilemma of Russia. That's why they again, I've been arguing this for decades, that they will stick with him.
Yes.
Although, despite all the things that they don't like about him, but I mean, they don't really know how to get rid of him and keep everything that is guaranteed under him still guaranteed. But it's another long story. But base is not a replacement of Lukashenko.
Okay, that was actually very opportune, because the question I was going to pick out from the audience was about this kind of geopolitical consequences. So I'll read it to you. That's from Alexander Amonak. The Belarusian protest did not include a geopolitical aspect, but rather it has geopolitical consequences. What kind of consequences do you think there are? Well, we already mentioned, Lukashenko plus military base is superb guarantee for Russia to retain the status quo. But when would the balance be tipped off in one way or another? Anyone?
I mean, I'll just jump in very quickly if I can, just to come back to something I was saying before, that I think it's, if not geopolitical consequence in the normal sense, I think that the extent to which since 2020, but particularly in the last few months since the start of the migrant crisis, and now with the crisis in Ukraine, the extent to which the 2020 election and its aftermath is being cast by some Western political figures as part of a kind of evidence of a kind of Manichaean struggle emerging between authoritarianism and democracy, between light and dark. And certainly our current foreign secretary seems to be positioning herself very much in that way. I mean, that has significant implications, I think, for how states like the UK engage with how you go about resolving the current crisis. For example, if it's seen not just as a question of European security, for example, but in the aftermath of the 2020 elections, as evidence of these kind of blocks developing based on divergent values, but with military geopolitical consequences attached to them, then that becomes very significant, I think. And it actually, of course, makes crises much harder to resolve, because they become not just about the crises, but about much more fundamental issues.
I think one colossal geopolitical implication of the protests the way they went was that the West, that it allowed the West to stay absolutely passive in the first several months, because they basically said, it's not about us, it's not about geopolitics, we can withdraw. And this is something we are harvesting now, because it's the unwillingness of the West to go into clashes with Russia over Belarus 18 months ago was definitely a factor that convinced some people in Kremlin that the West is weak, and the West will always be retreating as soon as you threaten seriously enough. And that's obviously something that started during the autumn of 2020, when the West was absolutely unwilling to do anything. Maybe because it had its fingers burnt in Ukraine in 14-15, maybe because it thought, and again, we cannot criticize it for thinking that way, that Belarus was already part of the Russian sphere of influence, and it had no chance to snatch it from Russia's hands. But whatever was it, the fact that the geopolitical pro-European slogans were absent from the protest pretty much facilitated for the West the task of staying idle. Thank you.
If I may.
Franak, please.
Yeah, I want to agree and disagree with Arkadia on some points. I don't think it's a mistake of protest, because it's not something which was stated or developed by leaders of the group. It was something which was living in Belarusian society. They didn't want to get into the geopolitical fight, and they didn't see the fight against Lukashenko as the part of geopolitics. And we were not able to shape this as the narrative because we were not in control of the crowd. Crowd developed the narrative, and this narrative just existed when we just tried to become the voice for the crowd. But what I agree on, that it's not Lukashenko and Putin who are strong, but this is the West who are Western countries who are weak, or at least seem to be weak for Lukashenko and Putin, because Lukashenko actually he enjoyed many months of non-reaction when sanctions got imposed there with many loopholes, and they just raised the price for potash, and potash continued to come to buyers. After Protasevich and even now with the cow, there is no unity among Western countries, and Lukashenko, of course, and migrant crisis, the same story. So he basically didn't face much reaction response, which created the feeling of impunity and understand that he can continue and raise stakes. And this was for Lukashenko, this was for Putin, the same story. And I think if the West right now will put Belarus on the agenda, will be same firm in statements at least about Belarus, like about Ukraine, it could help us a lot to prevent the worst case scenario. And let me propose here some recommendation for the international community and for the European Union. So I really think it's the good moment for the European Union, for signatories of Budapest Memorandum, for those who care about Belarus, to release the statement position like Americans released Belarus Democracy and Sovereignty Act, something that will raise the cost and that will declare that Belarusians deserve to decide, to determine their future by themselves, and no Russia or other countries allowed to misuse Belarus in their geopolitical or other interests. We had many discussions with European parliamentarians, etc., but there is no such law. Other thing, not law, but act, something that could serve as the law, and will create commitment for our allies to defend Belarus independence. We see here many words of support for Ukraine and very little about Belarus. It's also important to support Belarusian identity, Belarusian language, Belarusian media, everything which is strengthening Belarusian identity. And this could be even stronger than military bases. When identity will be strong, when Belarusians will feel Belarusians will cherish Belarusian independence, then the integration, occupation, or foreign influence will be much less effective. It's very important to increase sanctions, increase pressure on the regime, but also make sure Russia does not misuse this weakness of the regime and is not buying out the enterprises, which is also a possible scenario. And it's very important to not legitimize Lukashenko by speaking to him, talking to him, calling him, sending ambassadors. Some European states are considering sending ambassadors and presenting credentials to Lukashenko, as well accepting his ambassadors in their country. In this moment, it will be very bad signal to Belarus society as well. And I think this combination of pressure and assistance to civil society, which is continuing struggle in very bad circumstances, it could help us actually to remain resistant on one hand, and to make this worst case scenario less possible.
Thank you, Franak. Now we're coming to a close, and I'm delighted that Franak actually has started this kind of conclusion with offering recommendations. Can I please invite then Vladislav, Ruth, and maybe Arkady would like to add recommendations based on our discussion, but also your knowledge of the issue. Vladislav, please.
Yes, thank you so much. So, look, I agreed with most of what was said. I think that actually there are not so many recommendations these days, because I agree absolutely with Arkady, who said that the time is lost. And I do not see any kind of events which can ignite another wave of sanctions. These days, we should just, and the West should just wait and see what happens after this new debate and voting of the new constitution. Maybe some new protests may arise. Maybe Lukashenko, some Lukashenko's moves might be, might cause another round of sanctions. But anyway, I would say that now we are in kind of rather stable situation with no any breakthrough in sight. So for coming 1 or 2 years, I would say that everything will be in place. I absolutely exclude any open attack on Ukraine in coming days and weeks. So it's like business as usual. Nothing will happen actually, and the West capacity, the West ability to change the situation is very limited these days.
Okay, thank you, Vladislav. Ruth, please.
Yeah, well, I agree with all of that. I think. I think part of the problem for thinking about a kind of Western response is, of course, as we've all touched on, that we can't really think about a unified West in this regard, because states have different interests and different perspectives on what's been happening. And I think one of the reasons why you didn't see a stronger response in 2020 was that, of course, the then government in the US, the Trump administration, had a pretty clear policy of not engaging at all with questions of democracy and human rights in the post-Soviet space or in any kind of former Soviet states. So that that is kind of an example of the difficulty that we have in thinking about a coordinated Western response. And of course, even a coordinated European response is difficult, given that my own country has now left the European Union. So we can't work cooperatively entirely successfully with our European partners on Belarus or anything else. But there is going to have to be some attempts to engage in more coordination if Western states want Belarus, their engagement with Belarus, their relationship to Belarus, to change at all. And one of the things that worries me is that I don't think Western states are sufficiently focused on Belarus to actually sit down and try to work out their differences on what could or should be done. Although I entirely agree that the issue of constitutional changes, if that does produce protests, may invite a more coordinated response. But I'm not optimistic.
Thank you, Ruth. Arkady, would you like
what
to?
I'm going to say is obviously easier said than done, and yet I will say it. there's no way for Belarus to go back to the social contract it used to have with Lukashenko, not only before 2020 and not only before the protests of 2017, but even before 2010. The country is completely different from what it used to be 15, 20 years ago. We know enough of that. So despite the massive emigration, despite all the tragedy that happened, it's not the end of days. People will think, they will look around, they will not be happy with what they will be offered by this regime, because this regime is not going to change. This regime, you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. He will be talking the same talk he's been talking for the last 27 years. What does that mean in terms of recommendations? This newly growing and indifferently thinking people will need to be shown an alternative. If they are told all the time that, yeah, the majority supports the union with Russia, the neutrality, the neo-Finlandization, I mean, they will be suffering from the syndrome of learned helplessness. That's the only thing. So they need to be shown that actually there is a different future for the country and for them individually. And in that, there is a role both for the West and for the opposition, which is abroad. Because, again, I understand that the politicians should see what the potential voters think. They cannot be too detached from the mainstream thought. But that's the function of a leader. You need to lead. You need to change the public opinion, however difficult that might be. But of course, as in a small caveat about the West in particular, I would make sure that some of the people which lobbied the policy of rapprochement with Lukashenko in 2015, 2020 would be held responsible. They would need to be fired, and that needs to be known, because such a terrible miscalculation that was made by the European Union, which led to the fact that the pro-European cohort in Belarus was totally weakened. Before that, it disappeared basically before, and that people in Belarus were not prepared to protest under the slogans of the European choice. Those people who lobbied that policy need to be held responsible.
Okay. Thank you, Arkady. Indeed, I think on this more or less hopeful note that the future is actually in our own hands, and more importantly, still in the hands of Belarusians, I think we're going to finish this discussion. Can I just also mention, there were some questions from the audience, including, for example, from Anais Marin, about kind of constitution and text of constitution. Can I please invite you to follow our program, because we will have a separate talk on constitution, and I please ask these questions then. But in the meantime, what is left for me to say that we hope you will join us next Thursday on the discussion about sanctions and counter sanctions for Belarus and by Belarus. And in the meantime, I would like to thank our speakers for this absolutely fascinating discussion. And you see, that's why we find it difficult to stop it, but because you brought out so many important issues to the front. And I also would like to thank the Office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Oxford Belarus Observatory for organizing it. Thank you, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.